Hello, friends of the IACL blog, and welcome to another book interview. My name's Elisabeth Perham. I'm one of the co-editors of the blog, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Tom Daly and Dinesha Samararatne, who incidentally were former co-editors of this blog. And we're going to have a quick chat about the edited collection called Democratic Consolidation and Constitutional Endurance in Asia and Africa, Comparing Uneven Pathways. And the edited collection was published by Oxford University Press last year. So welcome to both of you, and congratulations on the publication of the collection.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Lizzie.
And so before I've got a few questions I'll ask you, but I'll just briefly introduce you both for the listeners and watchers. So starting with Tom Daly is a professor at Melbourne Law School. He's also a convener of the Constitutional Transformation Network and the director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network, both based at Melbourne Law School, and the director of the global research platform Demoptimism, which focuses on evidence-based hope for democracy worldwide, something we really need right now. Welcome, Tom. And Dinesha Samararatne is a professor at the Department of Public and International Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. She's a member of the editorial board of the Indian Law Review, and since 2023, she's held an appointment as an independent expert to the Constitutional Council of Sri Lanka. So the first question I wanted to ask you both was whether you can tell us a little bit about what was the catalyst for pulling together this edited collection.
So first of all, Lizzie, thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about this book, but also the book as it stands for us in terms of what we think we are contributing to the field and to the scholarly community through this book. So this book was conceptualized around 2019, and we started off the process in 2019 itself, before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there were three editors. Dr. Asanga Walikada from Edinburgh Law School was also part of the team, and subsequently, for reasons beyond his control, he couldn't continue to be part of the team. So the conceptualization was done very much in conversation with him. And as you would know, all three of us have worked in a diverse set of jurisdictions. I think Tom and Asanga more so than myself. And because of that, as potential editors, we came together with the understanding of three themes. First, that there are many understudied or invisible jurisdictions in the field of comparative constitutional law. Second, because these jurisdictions have been understudied, we were acutely aware that there were underexplored and extremely significant themes, insights that could be looked at if we paid more attention to these understudied jurisdictions. And third, all three of us had worked with and were in conversation with key voices from these jurisdictions who could offer these underexplored themes to a global audience. So I think those three lines of awareness brought the three of us together to think of doing a book project. And perhaps I'll pass on to Tom to say a little bit more about how that took off.
Yeah, because it was really interesting. I mean, the minute I was told about the book, it sort of hooked me because, as Dinesha says, you know, it really resonates with so much of what we're interested in. I mean, how do you build a sustainable democracy or build on even the beginning steps of what might be a window opening for possible liberalization that could become democratization? And you know, we had all been working on different states and had knowledge of different states, and it was kind of an interesting project just to bring that knowledge together. And it was the case studies as well for me that was just really interesting to look at this suite of case studies of Ethiopia, Gambia, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And really, you know, we're talking about a cohort that are all understudied in their own right, but also who are very rarely looked at together, even in small clusters. And so that gave us a different starting point to talk about all of these questions. And so, yeah, I was, as I say, I was hooked from the beginning, and really glad that we were able to bring it to fruition.
Excellent. And so then that brings me to the next question, which is, so the book's organized in two parts. So you have a set of chapters that look at themes, and then you have those 7 case studies that are drawn from Asia and Africa that you've just listed. So I guess I'd be interested in knowing why it's organized that way, how you kind of went about, you sort of started to explain that, but how you went about selecting the kind of themes and the case studies for exploration in the book.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'll say my view of it, and maybe pass over to Dinesha. But funnily enough, initially the structure was to place the country case studies first, and then have the thematic chapters. And that really was to emphasize that the collection wasn't just about taking existing theory off the peg and applying it to these 7 case studies, but actually really taking those country contexts seriously as a starting point for theorizing, and not just modifying existing theory, but actually starting from a different starting point and looking at what might be central to theorization for the collection that comes out of the detail of those country contexts. So it was actually in the production process that we switched, but that didn't change the writing process, in the sense of there was still the way Dinesha and I organized it, and the way Dinesha and Asanga initially had, I think, conceived it from the outset, was very strong engagement between the thematic chapter authors and the country case study authors. So we had, online workshops for the authors. We had follow-up questions that could be done by email between authors, and so on. So that, I think, that shows in the collection that there was, the theory was very, very mindful of the country context.
Yeah. So Lizzie, there is one other book published in the 1980s, which tries to situate African and Asian jurisdictions together. And as you know, even today, while there is so much more awareness about this whole idea of understudied jurisdictions, we still don't, we still think in terms of regions, geographical regions.
Yeah.
And in our case, like I said, because the editors came to this with some level of exposure to diverse jurisdictions, we were able to bring jurisdictions that are not necessarily placed in the same framework together. In fact, OUP had a question about that as well. And we then made the case for situating these this interesting set of jurisdictions together, because we were also following our intuition to some extent when we designed it this way. Just on how we actually operationalized it, I think we had 3 cycles. We had an original set of questions which the case study authors answered. Based on that, the thematic authors had their own framework, and during the workshops as well as offline, there was some exchange through which both sets of chapters were being shaped by each other. And I think the chapter on the pandemic was perhaps most emblematic of this process, because Joel actually had to draw very intentionally from the insights that we offered through the case studies. So, and then of course the introduction came right at the end, drawing from all of this. So we really did see ourselves as trying to work out what ground up theorization can look like in this context. And mind you, originally we had thought that we would all be in the same room in Melbourne working this out, but we had to make do with the online interaction, and I think we managed fairly well, and we were able to come up with a structure that was both practical but also hopefully useful.
Excellent. And I guess that then takes us to the next question. So obviously, the next question I was going to ask is, what do you see as the collection's main contribution? Some of that's quite clearly coming through. I mean, ground up theorization from case studies that aren't often studied, and if they are studied, not studied together. But yeah, what do you think's kind of come out of it, and who would you like to read it?
Difficult questions, Lizzie. So in terms of main contribution, I think some of the themes that we picked up, like constitutional culture, civil-military relations, role of political parties, these are perhaps, if not the first time we are looking at it in this particular way, tapping into a conversation that is at an early stage. I would say, speaking just for myself, being able to curate and support the development of the chapter on civil military relations was very exciting, because it was a theme that I had engaged with, had thought about, and to then actually be able to have help someone to produce that chapter meant that we could then use that to do some of the other work that we wanted to do. So we certainly think that the themes that we pulled out of these case studies are unusual. And we are hoping that that will be one aspect of the main contribution. The second contribution is perhaps more methods-oriented than theory-oriented, and that is to bring to what we call the mainstream voices that are not necessarily in the mainstream. So authors who are living in and working in the jurisdictions that we are writing about. And I can say that that was not easy, because on top of this being the time of the pandemic, in each of these jurisdictions, there were very significant constitutional developments that led to real life challenges. I mean, I can just mention Sri Lanka 2022 as an extreme example of this. But I mean, all of us were committed to taking that challenge head on, because we were convinced that that was very important for the field. And there's much more we can say about that. In fact, in the introduction, we explore that. So I'll perhaps pass on to Tom to say a little bit more. But just on the main audience, I will be very honest with you and say that I struggle with that question, because I have this book here with me. I have donated copies of the copies that I got to the main libraries in Sri Lanka, but really no one can afford to buy this book here.
Yeah.
And it's in English, which is a language that a minority will use. So I have to accept the fact that the main audience is the privileged intellectual community of the global north. And that is something we are mindful of, and something that is a source of dissatisfaction for both of us, if not for the other authors as well. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge. We pick it up at the very end of our joint introduction, and you know, you just have these structural obstacles in place, whether they're linguistic or whether they're price point. And we had these discussions about whether there are different price points that the book could be put at. I think there's a lot more. I think we've learned a lot in terms of how you might approach this for a future collection, for example. And I think it just connects us with the whole idea of open access as an open, as an ongoing conversation. Talk about that a lot here in my research impact role, but it really is very real, because you could have any number of audiences for this. You could have fellow scholars, you could have office holders themselves on the ground, you could have activists, international organizations, but often as a scholar, it's easy to forget that so many of these audiences do not have access to this type of material. They don't have a dedicated library, and then even if they do, then you have the linguistic issue. But just to track back to just the main contribution, I think one of the things that freed us up was having the structure the way it was, because with the thematic chapters as they were, and with this great sort of mix of established and emerging scholars, and some very new sort of frameworks coming out of some of the chapters. So, with our wonderful friend Julius Yam, who left us last year, unfortunately, as this amazing chapter on courts and how they're actually such a marginal presence in the 7 case studies that we look at. And it's the way he talks about that absence actually is so illuminating. And also in Mauli Banerjee, for example, talking about parties, and she talks about how the identity of parties, whether they come out of an independence movement, for example, versus other sources, means they play a different role and they have a different self-conception. All of that coming together freed us up to talk about the bigger issues in the extended introduction, which is about 14,000 or 15,000 words long. I think it ended up very long, didn't it, Dinesha? But it gave us a chance to kind of map the case studies a little bit more, compare them, and also talk a little bit more about the method side of things and things like community building as an aspect of creating a collection like this. And just dealing a little bit more, in a thicker way with the conceptual framework. So we tried to get into a little bit more, what does democratic consolidation mean? What does constitutional endurance mean? How do they work together? And how do they actually relate and help us understand these 7 case studies?
Thanks both. And those reflections also, I think, there's a work that both of you have done a lot in the field, and I know it's sort of the foundation also of the blog is this idea of trying to make sure that we bring to the mainstream voices that otherwise might not be heard. So that's certainly something that kind of your legacy carries on here as well in that sense. I had a question here about challenges, but I think we've heard already quite a lot about the challenges. I mean, I think people who wrote edited collections during COVID spent a lot of time on Zoom. Was there anything else you wanted to reflect on that note?
Dinesha, do you want to take that one? I have my own thoughts.
Yeah. So in terms of theory building, when we conceptualized the book project, we were looking at one almost like a moment in each of these jurisdictions, which was a moment of democratic consolidation. But while we were working on the chapters and the project as a whole, that moment evolved. And we also saw, so if we were to call it an upward movement, the downward movement as well. So I think my video settings are on blur, so you will not see this if I hold it up again, but maybe Tom, if you have the book, you can show the cover. So the cover is of a tree stump, and then you see the word escapes me at the moment.
A shoot, a little
shoot, a little shoot,
little green
right?
shoot.
So yeah, so it symbolizes that cycle that we've observed in most of our case studies, where there is this period of democratic consolidation, and you see resilience, endurance, and then deep challenges that almost emerge out of that moment. So we wanted to highlight that and show that perhaps moving away from a linear approach to looking at the cycle would also help us both as academics but also practitioners, because most of us are academic practitioners in these jurisdictions, to anticipate for the downward and the upward. And then, of course, beyond that, we don't really address it in this book. There is also that whole aspect of affect and hope, which sort of we don't theorize about, but is very much part of this. So that is, I think, also a central focus in this project. And now, how does that relate to challenges? It relates to challenges because, so you're living and working in these jurisdictions and also trying to write about it while dealing with this movement. And if you're in an academic context or in the practice context, there are certain conditions which make it hard to set aside time to write, which actually brings us back to this earlier point we made about understudied jurisdictions. We know why these jurisdictions are understudied. There are certain life conditions which make it difficult for people who know about these jurisdictions to write about it. So that was a day-to-day challenge that we worked with. We had to constantly review our deadlines, constantly adjust our expectations, and also be respectful of the tone, style that some of our authors adopted. And to create the space for that without trying to sort of compel everyone to fit in within a limited template, so to speak. And then I must acknowledge there were times when Tom had to step in and take the greater burden and responsibility of the editorial role, because I couldn't perform my editorial role because of the challenges that I was facing both intellectually, professionally, and in my personal life. So it was a real sort of training ground in taking on this whole idea of taking understudied jurisdiction seriously. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we were dealing with the lockdowns during all of it, but actually interacting with Dinesha and with our authors, it was useful perspective, I must say, at times. You're dealing with such an array of crises. I mean, societal crises on top of everything else. But even at the more banal level, some people dealing with absolutely crushing teaching workloads, for example, right? Which is not going to be obvious to somebody who's in a well-heeled Western university, right? Where you are, usually we all gripe about it, but you do have time to research. Um, and I think it, it was an object lesson for me, to be honest, in what does it mean to be allied together, because it's not about people from the global south somehow sort of just not writing about things. It's about how do you create the material conditions that at least mitigate the obstacles that they're facing and provide some level of structure and and support. And there you can find an opening where you actually do get to hear from the voices that need to be heard. And it was one more reason why I was really I felt very honored to be brought onto the project, but also it kind of very much spoke to the message of the book itself, that together we all persevered and together we all made the book happen, because our authors just played a blinder as well under very difficult circumstances, and the quality of what they produced as well. It's not just that they finished their chapters, but that they finished them to such a high quality, and I think that's something for us all to reflect on as we go forward, is how do we sort of use the structures that we have in comparative constitutional studies as a community to actually build on this kind of model, and to bring people together in a productive way.
Thank you. And then the last question I wanted to ask you both was what's next, or what's kind of ongoing in terms of academic projects? I know you're both very busy in all sorts of directions, but just what are kind of some of the small things, or big things, I guess, coming up?
Very quickly, Lizzie, I think I just said three things. One, working on this volume and the one before that gave me a lot of confidence, because I had the privilege of working with fantastic editors, fantastic authors. It gave me the confidence to think about book publishing in a serious way, because I hadn't, for a lot of different reasons, part of which is the material conditions that I live and work in. So two things. One, I'm currently working on looking at different discourses on the rule of law through the lens of constitutionalism as it plays out in Sri Lanka. And hopefully there'll be a book on it in the recent future. Second, this is something that I have been thinking long and hard about the last 1.5 years. What are the value commitments that we need to highlight and sort of understand if this whole idea of a guarantor branch or guarantor institutions that are emerging in the global south are to endure. And obviously, this is now coming out of my own personal experiences. So what kind of people do we need in these institutions if they are to really perform the guarantor function that we think is being respected or protected or looked at through these institutions? So those are the two areas that I'm trying to work on. Thanks.
Excellent. Tom?
Yeah, there's a lot happening. I suppose one of the biggest or possibly hardest to write things that I'm working on that flows directly out of this book is what I've started calling the core periphery challenge in comparative constitutional studies, because what this book shows in many ways is it's not just a global south, global north dichotomy. We know that there's the south within the south, there's the marginalized within the south, and there's the marginalized across those sort of imagined boundaries. And yeah, I just want to write on that, to a greater sort of degree than I have to to date. And partly it's probably also informed by the fact that I'm from Ireland, which is a global north state that is marginalized in comparative constitutional studies, or at least only certain dimensions are sort of talked about. And I think there's something more to be explored there. The second thing really is the big constitutional design questions coming out of our current era of democratic crisis. So the major area where that's coming out for me is current work on constitutional repair after periods of democratic backsliding. So I've been working on like Poland and the USA and Brazil and Hungary to some extent. And I mean, USA is back into backsliding quite vociferously, but there are a lot of major constitutional design questions coming out of the debates about how to repair, because they inevitably become questions about constitutional design and should institutions have been working differently or been designed differently in the first place. So that's definitely a second point of departure. And the third one is post-juristocracy is what I'm calling it. It's what does our field look like after all of the experiences we've seen of courts, I don't want to say failing, but, you know, not being as central an institution in buttressing the system as we have tended to expect from country to country. And what does that mean for how central courts are still in our field? So much to write. It might be 5 years at least, but hopefully some of the constitutional repair stuff will be coming out this year.
Excellent. Well, so those sound like two really exciting agendas. And thank you both so much for joining me to share a little bit about the book. And thank you also to any people listening or viewing us. If you enjoyed the discussion and you'd like to get a hold of the book or have a look at the cover, head on over to the new titles and discounts section on our website. There's links and information about getting hold of the book there. And as always, for more of the same, keep up to date with the blog by following us. We're on X still at the moment, subscribing to our mailing list. And if you've got a recently published book that you'd like to chat to us about, then get in touch via email. That's also on the blog website. Thank you both very much.